All right, I'm Lloyd Mckenzie. I've been involved with FHIR since before it was called FHIR. I stick my finger into a wide variety of FHIR pies. I'm no longer on the FHIR management group because we're rotating through and getting more people involved in that, which is awesome. I am a co-chair of FHIR infrastructure. I'm now on the technical steering committee because I can't not be on some sort of governance body of some sort. I don't know what else to do with my time. And in terms of my involvement in this particular set of stuff, I've been heavily involved in the evolution of obligations, also heavily involved in the use of questionnaires and guidance around the use of questionnaires in FHIR and using them in this particular initiative, and have authored lots of implementation guides and have desired to have test cases for all of them and have written test cases for none of them because it seemed like too much work. But that's not good because test cases are important. And so hopefully what I'm building right now will be helpful to me and to other folks as well. So what we're going to cover is we're going to talk about obligations. If you've never heard of them, I'll ramp you up at least a little bit, but I'm not going to tell you everything you need to know about them. We're going to look at how obligations relate to testability and what they start to enable that we haven't been able to do before. Take a look at the framework that I had expected to have completed by today and don't, because I started writing it on Friday and I was at a scout camp all weekend. I wasn't procrastinating, I was just doing other higher important things. But it is coming along and I do expect to have it available for general use probably end of the month-ish. So that other people can play with it too. We'll show you where it's at. And also talk about what it can't do. Because as much as I would love a magical solution that would just generate all of the test cases that I want and test an implementation guide completely, not there, and I don't expect to be there, and we'll talk about a little bit about why. So we have lots of implementation guides. Lots and lots and lots of implementation guides. And typically people write those implementation guides because they want systems to actually comply with them, which means that you kind of like to validate that they comply with them, because trusting people to just say that they comply and know what they're talking about doesn't work that well, even when they're good people, because I sometimes think that I comply with things and then get tested and realize, oh, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. And of course, we want to do all of those things efficiently. And if we end up having to spend 10 times the money on writing the test cases as it took to write the implementation guide, we are not really very far ahead. So we have an implementation guide. And an implementation guide, one of the beauties of FHIR implementation guides is they have a lot of computable stuff in them. Specifically, they have capability statements. And when we put a capability statement in an implementation guide, it defines what a particular system functioning within that implementation guide is expected to do. And we can embed some extensions in that that talk about things like shall do this, or should do this, or may do this. Because often when we are defining implementation guides, there is some wiggle room. And so we need to be clear about what is it you have to do and what is it that we'd like you to do, or that you might want to do. And then we have profiles that define the structures. So capability statements are sort of about the flow and the process, and profiles are about the structures. And we now have, although not really in widespread use yet, but starting slowly, the ability to capture obligations within our profiles, which are computable descriptions of the expectations of the systems involved in creating and or consuming data associated with those profiles. So that's our starting point. We presume that those things exist. And the first thing that we want to do coming out of that is say, okay, this describes what's possible, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what you are claiming to do. Because what you are claiming to do is some subset of those shoulds and mays, and often subset of the obligations, because the obligations also contain shoulds and mays. And in order to test a particular system, we kind of need to know what is it that you actually do. And so it'd be nice if we had a quick and easy way that we could just give to a particular software developer or vendor and say, we got an implementation guide. You say that you comply with this implementation guide. Please go fill out this questionnaire and tell us what of the optional things within this guide you do and don't do. Then, when we have an answer to those questions, which in everything, of course, is in FHIR, because why would you not do everything in FHIR, is a questionnaire response. And with that questionnaire response, we can then, in theory, generate test scripts that are specific to that particular system, that test the exact functionality that that system claims that they do, test the specific data elements that that system claims that they support, and the obligations that they claim that they support, and see if it does in fact do what they said that it was going to do. In theory, we could also help out our implementer and vendor friends by producing a system-level capability statement, because they've already gone through and answered all the questions about what is it that they actually do, and a capability statement at the system level is supposed to be a reflection of what they actually do. I haven't decided whether or not this makes sense, in part because systems typically do more than just a single implementation guide, and so I don't know if there's value. If there is value, and we can do the bottom part, it will be relatively straightforward to also do the top part. We'll see whether there is demand and interest. I figured I would throw it out there as something to talk about. So let's look at these pieces a little bit more, because some of you perhaps aren't super familiar with all of these resources, and that's okay. Capability statement has been around for a long time. It is one of the largest conformance resources that we have, if not the largest conformance resource that we have. And it's focused on talking about either what a specific system does or what a candidate system should do. So it goes through and says, what are all the resources that you support? What are all of the RESTful interactions? So do you support search? Do you support version-specific read? Do you delete? Do you do conditional delete? All of that kind of stuff, as well as any custom operations that you support, what search parameters you support, what messages you produce or consume, what documents you produce and consume, etc. And then we have a handy-dandy extension that we can stick pretty much everywhere in capability statement that allows us to mark all of those things with a should or a shall or a may. So you can say care plan is a shall, patient is a shall, observation is a should, family history is a may, and you can do that same thing with reads and searches and all of the other stuff. Obligations are something that was introduced as an extension alongside R5, and it was a reaction to a lot of feedback we had about the must support element on element definition, where must support talks about what are the expectations we have for systems that are sort of outside of what the data structure itself says. So the example I often give is deceased state. You don't want to mark deceased state as mandatory because hopefully most of our patients aren't deceased and we don't want them to be, but you do want to set some expectations about you must be able to display or capture or store in your database or take into account in this algorithm something about deceased state. And so we said, well, we use must support for that. If you flag it as a must support, then there's stuff that you have to do. The problem with must support is that the stuff that you have to do is expressed in text somewhere in the narrative of your implementation guide or maybe the intro or the notes section of your profile, or maybe in the notes of the specific data element that it's on. And of course, we write all of that stuff in varying ways and in confusing ways, and it's not super computable. And so the notion of I'd like to be able to automatically generate test cases, that doesn't happen when you have content that is in narrative. Obligations, on the other hand, are computable. They are very specific codes that say things like shall persist, or should display, or may allow user input, or shall not alter. And furthermore, must support was a general statement that applied to the entire element, and you could set rules in your text about must support means for servers these things, and for clients these things, and for different types of servers different types of things. But once you had must support on something, it was there forever, and that interfered with reuse. Obligations, on the other hand, can be actor specific. So you can say, if you are a US core server, these obligations apply to you. And if you then derive from that US core profile and say, but I'm not interested in US core servers, I'm doing decision support, thanks, then those obligations don't apply to you, and you can make up your own set of obligations that are relevant in that particular space. And so we can be very precise about what we expect and who we expect it of. Questionnaires, I hope most of you are slightly familiar with at least. It's a resource in Fire that lets you capture pretty much anything that you can possibly imagine, because it's a whole bunch of name-value pairs, and you get to invent the names. And you can assemble them in hierarchies, and you can do all kinds of wonderful things like flow control and say, turn questions on or off based on answers to previous questions, and enable or disable certain answers. And the answers are, of course, computable, and you can do fancy things, including those defined by the Structured Data Capture Implementation Guide, which I use a whole bunch of stuff from. And then we get to test scripts, which is the end result of what I'm trying to come up with here, which are a computable way of defining a set of steps to test a system. You can define setup and teardown in terms of getting the environment to the state that you want for a particular set of tests. You can indicate what specific data is flowing where, and you can set expectations about what the results should look like and make assertions about what should be happening. You need a test engine to do that. There are a few test engines out there. In some cases, they will involve human steps, like a human being needs to actually type information into a system or look at the results and say, yes, I did indeed see this in the user interface or not. It really depends on what you're testing, whether it can be fully automated or not. We have these test scripts not as the only way of testing things in Fire, but they are a interoperable way of sharing things in terms of testing with Fire. And if you want to transform it into something that is specific to your particular environment, you can certainly go ahead and do that. So those are the pieces. When we create specifications, we often need to leave some degree of wiggle room, because there is variability in the real world, and it's not always reasonable for us to say everybody must do everything. Sometimes everybody can't do everything. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense for certain types of systems to do certain features because their user base doesn't need them, or it doesn't apply in their particular context. So we allow for the possibility that certain resources won't be handled, or certain data elements won't be handled. We define a bunch of search parameters, but not every server will support all of those search parameters. And we define those things in may, or should. And the difference between may and should is how much we're kind of hoping that you do it. But from a testing perspective, they're not really any different. It's, we can't count on this being there. In theory, every single Fire server will have a capability statement that tells you exactly what it does. And they will be super specific and super precise and completely accurate. Haven't seen a whole lot of those. I mean, I certainly have seen lots of capability statements, but the fully complete, fully computable, fully accurate, that's hard to do in practice. And so we need to get that information out. And the way that we're going to get that information out in this particular approach is with questionnaire. So let's talk about obligations and what it means for them to be testable. So there are certain types of obligations that are quite amenable to automated testing. So if you say you shall not alter, and the system supports either create or update, and supports either read or search, and has an expectation that it will persist the data, meaning when you send something to it, it'll hold on to it, and you can hope to get it back later. And populate, which means that it not only will it hold on to the data, it will actually give it back to you, because it's possible to do one without doing the other. Then we can test. We can send data in, and we can get data back, and we can check to see, did this data element change? And if it didn't change, we can say, at least for this particular test case, they did not alter it. Now, for all of these automatable tests, they are not exhaustive. If you have a system that alters certain data elements once every 1,000 times or whatever, or when a human being gets in the way, you're not necessarily going to pick that up, but at least you can do some basic checks that it's not changing the data as part of the persistence process. Like, let's just truncate off the time because we don't know how to handle that. You will be able to detect that. And that same sort of thing applies for several of these other obligations. So if we say you must persist this, then we put it in. So long as you also support populate, we can get it back, and we can figure out whether or not that data element is there. Now, in this case, if no alter isn't one of the obligations, we might look to see if it's changed, and if it's changed, we might give it a warning rather than an error saying, we put something in, we got something back, it didn't go away, so it seems like something was persisted, but it's not the same, so make sure that nothing hinky is going on. And we can do that for the rest of these. Reject if invalid is super easy because they don't need to persist it or populate it, they just need to yell. So we can try sending bad data in all of the different wonderful ways that we can invent bad data and see whether or not it chokes. And that's nice and straightforward. There are other types of tests where we can do automation, but it's a little bit harder for us to say for certain that a system is non-conformant. So you might have an obligation that says you will accept invalid data. There is an obligation like that. The reality is that obligation has some intrinsic limitations to it. If you try sending an MS Word document and call it JSON, you're probably going to get an error, and the accept invalid wasn't necessarily intended to apply in that circumstance. And exactly how rigorous accept invalid is going to vary somewhat. Or you shall ignore, that's also somewhat harder to test, but there are some things that we can do in the testing process to test at least this somewhat. There are other kinds of things that we can't computably check. If I mark a date and say, you shall include this in narrative, there are a wide variety of ways of expressing a date in narrative. I can send it YYYYMMDD. I can turn it into text. I can say the 5th day of January if I want to be really elegant or weird. And of course, the fact that a particular date happens to appear in the narrative doesn't necessarily mean that it's my date. I don't know what the context around that date happens to be. And if my instance has 3 January 7th of 2024 in it, and I see a January 7th, 2024 in the narrative, I have no idea which one it is. On the other hand, hopefully a human being with a checklist can go through and say, did you see a date with this value in this narrative with a label something like this-ish, and go through and say, yes, yes, I'm not sure, no, no, yes. And you can then use that as part of your evaluation. There are other obligations like handle, where the behavior is intrinsically left to narrative, and you really do need a human being to evaluate, commonly used in things like decision support processing, where handle means something different based on what your algorithm is. So we've got some of those. And then there are things like may alter, where you can't really test that at all, because it's not even really a conformance expectation of you're allowed to make changes. You're sort of explicitly stating the opposite of shall not alter, and some people want to be able to do that, but you can't really test this because it's not a failure if you can't alter it. It's okay if it happens to change sometimes, and there are some things that you can't really do easily there. Obviously, in order to do testing, we need data. And I could theoretically generate data on the fly, but that's a whole different project. If you want to connect this particular framework to a test data generation process that is profile aware, and I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of those out there, particularly ones that can manage invariance and co-occurrence constraints and stuff like that, then you can. But the general expectation here is that you come into the testing process for each one of your profiles with either a minimum or a set of minimum instances and a maximum or a set of maximum instances that can then be used in the testing process. And the reason why I say a set is if you have co-occurrence constraints that says you can either have a name or an address but not both, then in order to have complete testing, you need to have one instance that has an address and one instance that has a name, so that you can cover off that complete set of data elements, so that if you have obligations for address, you can test those. And if you have obligations for name, you can test those. Obviously, you also need something to test against. Some of the test engines stand up servers, and so they provide a testing partner for you if what you're doing is simple and straightforward. If you have a whole bunch of custom operations and custom messages and stuff like that, then you're going to have to work to ensure that you've got something that you can send data to that can generate a response. So those are also things that have to exist in order for this to work. Obviously, the fact that you pass testing does not mean that you are fully conformant. It means that we haven't demonstrated that you're non-conformant. That's as far as it gets. You will also have circumstances where the implementation guide says you shall persist, but doesn't have an expectation to populate because the system involved is acting like a black box. And in that circumstance, you can't do the automated testing, and it may be rather difficult even to do human review testing, because in order for the human to review, they have to go digging through your database, and lots of humans don't like to do that, not even testers. So your ability to use this framework really depends on the nature of the implementation guide and the expectations that it has. If you've got a really big implementation guide with lots of profiles and lots of resources and lots of data elements, you might be going through the I support this, I support this, I don't support this, I support this for a long time, because there are lots of things to choose between. it's actually a useful exercise to see what the questionnaire looks like to an IG author, to go, did we really intend to have this much optionality, and do we really need to have this much functionality, this many data elements? Because that's what you're actually asking of the implementer community. Every single place that you've got a question is something that they have to make a decision on, and decisions typically cost money. So it's useful, but it can be rather large. The other consideration is that your test instances may not necessarily pass business rules. And in general, there are business rules. So things like, yes, we accept names, but we expect our names to have a certain minimum number of characters, or they can't have accents, or they have a maximum number of characters, or we don't take patients who are only born this year. Those kinds of sanity checks that make perfect sense because you're a geriatric care center, and if you have a birth date that is 2024, then obviously somebody's made an error and you don't want to accept that data. The test framework doesn't know about that. So you may have to play around with your test data and rerun the generation process based on those kinds of considerations. In terms of what I'm planning to build, I'm not planning to touch messages. I said messages twice. I really, really don't want to touch messages. I had meant to say operations. Basically all of the custom stuff, because it gets messier to test in terms of questionnaires and all of that kind of stuff. In terms of RESTful interactions, I'm not dealing with patch or history or delete or conditional interactions. All of those things tend to be less common in implementation guides, and they also introduce all sorts of fun and excitement when it comes to trying to create test cases. Doesn't mean that these things can't be added to the framework at some point when somebody has the time and money to want to do so. I'm just not planning to do it in this round. And obligations, in addition to being able to filter based on who's doing it, can also have some conditionality to it. So you can have obligations that apply if category equals such and such, or if date is greater than some value, or all sorts of other things. Or you can have obligations that apply in Australia or in pediatrics, but not elsewhere. And I'm not trying to handle any of those things yet either. The fact that I haven't listed something here doesn't mean that a month from now I will have successfully covered everything else. That's simply my intention at the moment. We will see how things go. So now let's get into what it looks like. So I'm starting out with the physical activity implementation guide. It is not the version that is published on the website, which has no obligations. I've injected a bunch of obligations into my local version just so that I have something to mess around with, because it was a guide that I promised to create test scripts for, and so I figured, let's see if I can use this mechanism to create them. If you go look at the capability statements, there are 4 of them. Each of those capability statements list a whole bunch of resources and the search parameters and other things that are expected to be covered within them. And then we've got profiles. I've defined all of my obligations at the root rather than on the individual elements, because it lets me share all of my documentation, because generally when I set a rule that says you shall display this and you shall not error if it's present, the rationale for all of those things is the same, and I'm lazy and I don't want to repeat it all over the place. But in practice, whether you do it at the top or you do it on individual data elements doesn't matter. It will propagate all the way through. I was talking with one of the other main developers of the validator, who noted that the validator, the Java validator, is completely misnamed. It's really the Java Fire Swiss Army knife, because it does all kinds of things that have nothing to do with validation. And I'm just inserting another tool into that Swiss Army knife. The command at the moment is script questionnaire. You pass in the implementation guides that you want to generate. Because you're generating a questionnaire, you might want that questionnaire to have the same canonical root as the implementation guide because you're going to incorporate it, or it might be something that's you're generating outside. Whatever it is, you need to pass it. If you don't pass one, I'll come up with something for you. You can indicate what version you want the questionnaire to be spit out as, and then you indicate where do you want it to go. And now, we don't want to do that. Let's go look over here. So the results of running the process is it's going to yell at you about, well, first it tells you all of the things that it loads, which is all the dependencies of the implementation guide. And then it's going to come through and say, I didn't declare a profile on patient, and therefore it's going to ignore that. I didn't declare a profile on practitioner, so it's going to ignore that. It's not going to pay any attention to diagnostic report because I didn't define any obligations. So it's going to tell you all of the things that it can't test, which right now for me is a lot of them because I've only inserted obligations into one of my profiles. But in theory, eventually he'll go, oh, I guess I didn't define a profile for that, but seeing as I'm expecting people to conform, maybe I should. And hopefully this list of things will shrink and maybe even disappear entirely. What you will end up with is a questionnaire in JSON or XML, which is kind of ugly, but I'm going to go into, yes, wonderful, my ad block is up to date. I'm sure you're all excited to know that. I'm going to go to aid blocks and go grab my form, which it's stuck into a temporary folder for the test case. I'm going to load that form, and here's my little questionnaire. And it says, what's the name of my system? And we'll call it test. And then it says, which of the capability statements do I implement? And I'm going to say, I do care manager. And I've got enable when, and it automatically says, okay, seeing as you do care manager, these are the things that care managers have to worry about. So you can choose whether you're supporting any of these things, and I do support care plan, and it says, cool. So do you support update or search? And I can say yes, and I'll leave that one, and we can go through. There is a problem with AidBox right now. It doesn't support initial values, and this particular one, diagnostic report, is supposed to have an initial value of yes, because you don't have a choice about supporting this, but I can't mess around with it. The other thing is when I turned care plan on, it also turned on this profile and all of the data elements within it. So these are all of the data elements. If you remember a few screens back, there was a list of data elements that had certain obligations. These ones are supposed to be pre-checked, but again, they're not. These ones, on the other hand, I can go and make changes to. And so you would go through, make changes to fill out, this is what I support and what I don't support. And there's expectations from a client perspective, also expectations from a server perspective. So you go and fill all of this stuff out, and then you go and take a look at your questionnaire response, go save that somewhere, and then you're ready for step 2. You can use whatever form filler you like. LHC forms can also do this. LHC forms, however, doesn't have the grid control, so instead of having that nice little table, you just get a long list of questions. On the other hand, LHC forms does support having initial values populated, so that's kind of nice. The AidBox folks said that they would probably have this particular problem fixed in a week or so. So they're responsive, which is awesome. So that's that step. And the next step is performing a questionnaire extract. I'm currently using a brand new extraction mechanism. which SDC is considering including in the next release of SDC, where we embed a contained resource in the questionnaire, which acts as a template. And then we just embed some extensions in the various elements to say, go and grab this from answer to question 5, and go grab this from answer to question 6.7.3, and it fills out the resource accordingly. I have gotten as far as putting in the stub. This does not work. I was discussing with Bryn at lunch which extensions I should legitimately be using to do this. But I will be working on this for the rest of DevDays and on my trip home, and hopefully sometime mid next week it will be functioning. So that's what I wanted to share with you. We have the building blocks to do a whole lot more in terms of test script generation than we had previously. It's not going to cover everything, but even if we can point a tool, an implementation guide, and say generate all of the easy tests, that gives people something to work with, and it also starts to set an expectation of implementation guides should have tests. And if you don't have tests, how come? And sometimes the answer is because it's not testable. But in other circumstances, it's because I didn't do the things necessary to make it testable, and maybe I should. And the other thing is, once you've got the easy ones there, then people can perhaps, using that as a template, invest in some of the harder things and manually create the test cases that you can't necessarily do quickly and easily. In order to make this work, you do have to do work yourself as an IG author. You have to actually put in computable obligations and get consensus on what those should be, and figure out what should be mays and shells. You have to go through your capability statements and create them, and then again define your should, shells, and mays. It's not magic. It's not going to do everything for you, but anything that raises the bar and makes testing easier will hopefully be beneficial for the community. So that's me, and I did leave some time for questions, and I will answer what I can.
So I think this is so cool, and I can't wait to use it. One thing I think is probably assumed, but I didn't see it on the slides. Will this work if I put an obligation on like a search parameter in a capability statement?
At the moment, there is no mechanism to put obligations on search parameters. Okay. You can put shall, should, may on search parameters. And yes, it should take that into account. Okay. Search parameters are going to get fun because the reality is that most search parameters have a degree of conditionality to them. There are extensions that help you to document that conditionality, but you would have to use them in order for the tests tool to understand that. But yes, there is a mechanism where you can say you shall support this particular search parameter, and you shall use these two search parameters together. And I'm going to take at least a stab at doing some testing and making that work.
Awesome.
If we have IG has not have a lot of shells, maybe just should.
Yeah.
But you are, since you have a questionnaire now, and if people define the server, they can answer your questionnaire saying here, my server want to support this shell. They have the choice to do so now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So each server would receive the questionnaire. They would answer it themselves. Each server would potentially have a different set of answers based on what they actually do. And based on their answers, you could then generate a set of test scripts specific for them based on what they have said that they do. So you're evaluating them against their own specific claims. And so if they said that they did something and then the testing shows that they didn't, then either they made a mistake filling out the form, or they were a little over optimistic in terms of what they thought that they could do.
Okay, that's the loose part to tighter part. But if the server have something is should, but the implementer said, I don't think I need it. So they can to use the questionnaire to loose that up?
Well, if the implementation guide says should, then the implementer has the right to say, I don't want to. Either I can't, or that's the 2026 release, or I'm in geriatrics and I don't need that. Whatever their rationale is, they have the right to say, I don't do that, at least not right now. If the capability statement or the obligation says shall, the questionnaire isn't going to give them any wiggle room. The questionnaire, as designed, will actually show, yes, it will show them that, yes, this is something that you do. And they might try to turn the yes off and find that they can't and get really stressed at the fact that they can't. But that's what the implementation guide says. It doesn't give them the wiggle room on the shells. But anything that's a should or a may, they have wiggle room and they can decide, no, I don't do that right now.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Are obligations backported to R4? Will it work with R4?
Yeah, so obligations are defined as an extension in the Cross-IG extensions registry, and therefore they are available across all releases. There is, however, a component to obligations, which is actor definition, which says who is it that has this obligation. Those are defined in R5. However, the publishing machinery, in at least the Java side of things, is able to produce actor definitions for earlier IGs, and so you can still define actor definitions even though they're not technically an R4 thing. They show up internally as a basic resource, but they contain all of the stuff that you need, and it works in the framework. The IG that I'm working on is actually an R4 IG.
So instead of a questionnaire, why not just a derived profile and put that in your capability statement? Or am I missing something? Or is it you concerned about too many profiles, or why not just state what I'm doing?
So the rationale for the questionnaire is twofold. One is that profiles only cover the static behavior. So profile doesn't let you say, I support search, or what search parameters I support, or I support read. All of that stuff lives in capability statement. You could certainly create a capability statement that declared all of that stuff. The bigger challenge is the amount of effort that it takes to go through and fill out a questionnaire is 10 minutes for a shortish one, or maybe a couple of hours for a long one. Whereas documenting all of this stuff using profiling tools and capturing it all correctly using a capability statement is much, much more intensive, and would let you do a whole bunch more things and might itself be useful. But in terms of what's necessary to get testing to function is a significant overkill in terms of what we're trying to get out of this process. Because we're not looking for all of the regex rules that you have on different data elements and your particular set of cardinality constraints and all those other kinds of things. What we're really looking for is, do you support this data element, and what are the obligations that you're claiming to, optional obligations that you're claiming to support versus not. And we don't care about anything else.
Yeah, but I guess underneath the covers, the implementers are doing it. Why not document it explicitly is my question. And I understand it's a lot more work, and I understand why people are lazy or I shouldn't say that. You just want to get things done, but in the long run, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally fine for them to create a profile that documents all of these things. And in theory, we could use profiles that they've created to answer these questions rather than doing through a questionnaire response. But in terms of what I have seen from existing implementers, very few of them publish capability statements with the level of detail that would be necessary to do this automated testing, and even fewer are publishing profiles with the level of detail that would be necessary to do this testing. And so it's sort of what is the minimum viable product necessary to get the test scripts produced, and this seemed to be the most straightforward approach to make that happen.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank you.